Happy New Year and welcome to the new season of The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. During the holidays, America gave Nigeria a Christmas present, lobbing some bombs at Sokoto State. Some of the bombs fell in Kwara. This before the American kidnapped the President of Venezuela, then extended their travel restrictions so Nigeria visa applicants now have to pay at least $5,000 as part of their visa application. What is happening with the United States? China's top diplomat Wang Yi has started another African tour to advance Beijing trade and resources interests. Simultaneously, Botswana is counting Russia's investment with a new Moscow embassy. In Somalia, protests erupt against Israel's planned recognition of Somaliland, seen as a sovereign breach. How are African countries navigating this complex era of competing geopolitical overturns and pressures from their sovereignty? Nigeria's government has refused to delay the implementation of the controversial new taxes, insisting the measures are necessary despite growing public opposition and economic concerns. Will the government stance intensify public's backlash or force a policy rethink? Joining us today for further insights is Confident Mark Harry, a security analyst at SBM Intelligence. Welcome, Confidence, to the podcast. Confidence, you're welcome to the podcast.
Yes, Happy New Year, Veronica. Happy New Year to our listeners. It's good to be back here.
It's good to be back here. How was your holiday?
Same old, boring, dry, humid, hot. No, nothing different.
It's such an interesting times when you talk about what's happening all over the world. And Nigeria had its beats during the holiday. So on Christmas Day, we woke up to, information going around that Donald Trump he released it from his page, his True Social, saying the American have taken action and have bombed Sokoto. We also saw, some parts of it fell in Kwara State. And most recently, we're seeing the kidnap of President of Venezuela and the travel restrictions. And now you're seeing a cap of $5,000 put for people to be able to get visas to go to the US. What's happening in the US? I know that when Trump came, it was America first. We've seen him meddle in different countries' affairs, Nigeria included. Now his heavy-handedness on Venezuela. What's happening? What's your take on it? Let's start with the bombing in Nigeria. Do you think that he had any repercussion? Has it put terrorists to know that the country is not, even if Nigeria is not joking. Nigerian government said they collaborated with the US government, but we're seeing, did it have any effect? Is it deterring terrorists, or are we seeing the opposite of it? Are we seeing a backlash and more attacks? What's happening?
Right. It is important to start with the Nigeria Sokoto bombing thing. Not necessarily bombing like terrorist group carrying out bombing attacks, but the US hitting, striking terror groups
Hmm.
in Sokoto. It's important to establish that it is not exactly law or exactly verified that we have the Islamic State in Sokoto. At the very least, what we have is the Lekurawa and Al Qaeda faction that is on the ground that has been in Sokoto since 2017 when community leaders suffering the onslaught of banditry, which who could not rely on the Nigerian government to help, went all the way to Mali to request for help, to stem the issue, and then they brought some guys who came in, did actually help, but then later turned the guns on themselves. Given their strict interpretation of the Quran, they were named Likurawa, but they are an Al Qaeda faction. Although some conflict analysts have erroneously, and even the United States in this regard, have erroneously attributed them to the Islamic State Sahel province, which is a quite distinct Islamist group in and around operating in Tilaberi in Niger Republic. This was the group that the United States allegedly struck, even though reports, I think from the BBC, have said that the strike apparently didn't kill anyone. So this is what happened, and given some of the narratives that have been flying, it's important to establish the fact that the Americans think or believe that they are using these strikes to stop attacks on Christians in Nigeria. And it was quite it left quite a bit of a question as to why they are targeting Sokoto State, given that most of the attacks on Nigeria's Christians are done in the north central as well as the northeastern regions. And Sokoto is in the fringest part of the northwest, the seat of the Muslim Fulani Caliphate. The answer to that is that not much operations in terms of Nigerian Air Force sorties go on in Sokoto State, and for the Americans, they see the Lukurawa as an Islamic State group. It is very much easier for them to strike them. And given that Sokoto is sparsely populated compared with the north central and the middle belts, where strikes in that regard would have led to civilian casualties and then turned the tide against the intervention, they decided to hit somewhere safe. And even if they publicly acknowledge, even if they publicly state that people were killed, they also publicly acknowledge that this is the first of such targets, and more will continue. And to buttress this fact, there were continuous reconnaissance operations that was resumed almost immediately after the next day, to continue to monitor operations of armed groups across northern Nigeria. Which brings us to the topic about this, the Nigerian government saying that it's a partnership. It may have actually not really been a partnership, but for the Nigerian government to save face on its sovereignty issues, questions arising from Nigeria's sovereignty and the unilaterality of American strikes, they decided to say that it was a partnership. It was done in consultation with each other. That's between America and Nigeria. Bear in mind that the Americans didn't say such a thing. Now, to answer your last question, which is about the repercussions of these attacks, we have seen in the few days after the strikes that the Islamic State has upped its ante, the tempo of attacks against Christian communities in the Northeast. In the deeper parts of the Northwest, where the strikes happened, one could say that the population of the Christians there are not so much, and that you could not pinpoint for accuracy what. So we've had the Nigerian government try to spin this as not a violation of sovereignty, that they were consulted by the Americans before the strike went ahead. Bear in mind that the Americans have not made similar claims. They just said that they struck these positions. And one could understand that this is a face-saving mechanism by the Nigerian government. They've done it several times ever since the redesignation of the country of particular concern by the State Department came into light. But what we should be looking at now is that the continuation of these strikes, not just in Sokoto, but across the broader Northwest, across the Middle Belt, or possibly across the Middle Belt, and very importantly in the Northeast, where the Islamic State and several factions of Boko Haram, including the Jazz faction, have made their own homes. In the few days leading up after the attacks, we had, killings. About 9 villages in Sokoto, in Adamawa, in the Northeast, was attacked. They were attacked, and we had a couple of, incidents in the other parts of Cameroon, where the Islamic State boldly said that they are attacking these communities, especially Christian communities, in retaliation for what the Americans did in Sokoto. And in this case, most people may be looking at it as a fallout, because now Christians will be targeted. Christians have always been targeted. Much of the angst, much of the criticisms we should be having should be for the for reserved for the Nigerian government because this is their responsibility. Yes, the Americans have graciously done some of the heavy lifting in sense of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and the likes, which they've been doing since November. The Nigerian government was supposed to take the initiative after the fallout from the attack and the strikes in Sokoto and say, prepare for a worst case scenario, and then move to protect these communities who could be at the receiving end. But they didn't do that. And when we talk about some of these things, we have to also mention and remember that this is an abdication of responsibility by the Nigerian government, and they had no business getting it, you know, to metastasize to the point where it's metastasized so badly that we had another country intervening in our own security crisis, and then Islamist group who have eaten a chunk of our territory are now using Nigeria as a battleground to retaliate against geopolitical forces on the ground. Veronica?
In what we're seeing happen in Venezuela, um, do you think that other countries should speak up? Because I mean, are we also going to see that kind of takeover in an African country? I mean, and I'm referring to Nigeria, where we're also seeing Trump's heavy-handedness in the country as well.
At the moment, I doubt it. We have to first of all understand that Venezuela belongs to the American hemisphere, the Western hemisphere to start with, and very importantly, in what we could call America's backyard. Donald Trump is operating under the Monroe Doctrine, which was formed by President James Monroe in 1821, that looked at the Latin American countries primarily as America's sphere of influence, and then worked both publicly and covertly to expunge European colonialism in that part of the world, and which led to the Spanish-American War of 1898 and several other actions that undermined Spanish rule in what is today known as Latin America. I think in 1913, we have Theodore Roosevelt, adding to that, called the Roosevelt Corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, which sort of expanded, that doctrine. Ever since, we've not had Donald Trump refer to the Monroe Doctrine and then acted like it. A few days after the Venezuela incident, we had Stephen Miller, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House, is in charge of policy planning. He said America is a superpower and it's time for them to start acting like it. So America is trying to flex its muscles as a superpower. This is what superpowers do according to members of the Trump administration. And to answer your question as to why, whether we are to be saying an African country take the same thing, it goes back to the point I was making earlier, where I mentioned that Venezuela is firmly within what America considers its own sphere of influence. It is within the Western Hemisphere, and it is firmly within the Monroe Doctrine, the area that the Monroe Doctrine covers. Africa is not one of that. Some parts of Africa, especially West Africa, may be on the east, I think, western seaboard of the United States. But in terms of strategic priorities, it does not matter as much as what Venezuela or Latin America or even North America and the Arctic would. And as such, if you see problems with a government in Africa, you might see different forms of undermining that might happen. But in terms of putting boots on the ground to actively eject a sitting head of state in Africa, I don't think Africa matters that much in America's grand geopolitical bargain. And if we're going to see any African head of states being under that line of sight, we would have seen it happen with Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, because that country has had running problems in the United States, ranging from its closer cooperation with Russia and China, going down to naval drills, its action against Israel, and the whole white farmers, thing in South Africa, where there seems to be this fake news promoted by Elon Musk that white farmers are being targeted in South Africa by black people. So if all of these things have not come to a head, and then the Washington foreign policy establishment is baying for blood for South Africa in terms of removing the president, I hardly think that there's anything that is going to, spook the Americans so badly that they will want to repeat the same kind of thing. That is not to say that if they want
I
to
mean, I
do.
was going to say, on the one hand, people are also saying this step into Venezuela is for resources, and Nigeria has oil as well. So don't you think that regardless of we're not in their hemisphere, the thought of having the resources and oil would be a kind of like bait for them. Anyway.
On day, and if we had a lot of time in this podcast, I would have given you a crash course on foreign policy. Unfortunately, today is not the day, and now is not the time. But one thing I will leave you with is the fact that Nigeria has not been, in most of its independence, post-independence history, been out and out so anti-Western, so anti-American foreign policies that we are effectively ending cooperation with the United States. I think the only times in our post-independence history that we've come close to that was we are in the Murtala Obasanjo administration when we differed with the United States over cooperation the government in Angola, where we supported the one faction, I think it was the UNITA, and then the Americans supported the MPLA, or Nigeria supported the MPLA, and the Americans supported the UNITA, as a relic of the Cold War. Cold War rivalry extended to Angola because of America's rivalry with the Soviet Union. And then 20 years later, we had a similar issue where Abacha's human rights abuses became so really, really repugnant that the Americans and the Western world, including Commonwealth, decided to, establish sanctions on the Abacha regime. And then Abacha started to look eastward to countries like Turkey, Pakistan, China, and the likes. But even at that, it didn't really lead to a break in relations with the West, especially the United States. And then down to 2014, in Jonathan administration, when the United States refused to sell arms to Nigeria to prosecute the war against Boko Haram. Even at that, we still had considerable relations with the United States. And then I could also circle back a little bit to the Nigerian Civil War when Western countries refused to sell arms to the Nigerian government, then undergo on to prosecute the war, and only decided to reverse course when in 1968, number one, Port Harcourt fell to the Nigerian forces, which had used Soviet weaponry, and then the British felt that they would have been on the losing end if it continues, that embargo continues like that. The point of all of these examples is that we've had disagreements, we've had, what we'll call quanta with the Americans every now and then. It's just friendly quarrel in the manner of speaking. It hasn't been so obnoxious. Relations have been so obnoxious to Venezuela's level, so much so that the Americans would be so indignant at our recalcitrance and then choose to move to replace our head of state. At the very least, even if we are unhappy with them, relations still continue. We are very, very Western facing in our foreign policy. And even when we try to make our foreign policy Afrocentric, the Western bit is still very much there. So I don't see that happening in Nigeria, because if the Americans want to get our oil, they simply come and get it. They do not simply need all of these theatrics and all of that you get to see with Venezuela. They'll simply come and get it because we will be willing to offer it to them. I mean, Veronica, I don't know if you've been paying attention. We do not even have enough oil, for us to sell to the Americans to begin with. Most of them are hedged. And even if we dig new oil wells, like we are trying to do in and around Yankari in Gombe, as well as new Ogoni oil fields and the likes, I mean, the first port of call will be will be the Americans. They have a lot of money to spend in that regard. So when you look at resources and everything, there's no resource in the world. There's no resource in Nigeria at the moment in terms of natural or rare earths that Nigeria has, and the Americans cannot get elsewhere.
Mm. I mean, 2026 has started as an interesting year. Let's see how, things will play out. Let's move on to our second story. We're seeing China's top diplomat, take his African tour, trying to advance Beijing's trade and resource interests. We're seeing Botswana with Russia having a new embassy at Moscow. We're seeing Somaliland also being recognized by Israel. How are African countries navigating this complex era we've seen competing geopolitics, overturns and pressures? So how are we going to do all this pressure coming into Africa? How is Africa going to, manage this and ensure that they still maintain their sovereignty?
We should first of all look at the background to Wang Yi's trip. So every year, every January, the Chinese, for the past 31 years, the Chinese foreign minister begins this trip to begin the year with trip to Africa. This year would mark the 70th, no, okay, 2024 we had this Chinese Africa Forum, China Africa Cooperation Summit, FOCAC, that commemorated the 70th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and the African nations. So what we are looking at 2026 is called the China Africa Year of People to People exchanges. According to what I'm seeing from the Chinese website, Chinese government website, as well as the Chinese Foreign Ministry, it aims to foster mutual understanding, cultural synergy and shared modernization efforts through activities like youth festivals, cultural forums, poverty reduction seminars, innovation competitions, and expanded scholarship and visas for Africans rather. All of these things are just social issues that, of course, other countries would be looking at. But when it comes to China, cooperating at the head of state level, not necessarily at people to people level, you tend to look at it from the prism of first, economic partnerships through the initiative, which is rolled back now, and then with things like partnership in terms of mineral development and the likes. We see this year that Wang Yi will be covering East Africa, countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, and then he will also be going to Southern Africa and visiting Lesotho. A lot of these things would be mostly about shoring up China's political influence on the continent, restoring economic ties, and then trying to see if new partnerships would be struck. As to answering your question, where it leaves Africa's sovereignty, I think for many Africans who look at this, they would welcome this. They will welcome China's greater participation in the continent as a means of saying that this is what they've been praying for. Because for much of the past 2 decades, we've seen America's hyperpower in full use, and then some people have adduced this to a decline, given that rival power centers are now opening up, not just in Washington, but also in Ankara and in Beijing. And if the Chinese are coming into play, then it means better access, better options for Africa. So I think there's this quote I want to say now that's attributed to a Kenyan government official that said that whenever the Westerners, that's British and Americans, come, we get a lecture. But when the Chinese come, we get a bridge and a new hospital. African countries are looking at these things, looking at where their bread is most buttered. And yes, there will be criticisms as to how China operates, not choosing to meddle in the political affairs and then just doing business with whoever wants to do business. But at the very end of such deals, of such what is it called, of such cooperation, what we see is, at least from the very way China and its African partners try to portray it, is a partnership of mutual benefits where there is nothing like an overemphasis on human rights protection or political interference, but strictly business. Give me money, or you give me money to get cheap loans, and you build infrastructure, you build ports, you build bridges, you build roads, you build power stations and the likes. I don't think that many Africans who will be looking at Wang Yi Street will be spooked, given even despite some of the lectures that critics of China's engagement with Africa will be looking at. I think for most of them, even though the Belt and Road Initiative is no longer as strong as it used to be, I think they will still be inclined to do business with China much more than they want to do business with the West.
Let's move on to our final story where we're seeing the Nigerian government is refusing to delay the implementation of its controversial law. Do you think that this government stance will intensify public backlash or force a policy rethink? Just quickly before we close.
Right. It's not to um, reinforce a public backlash in the sense that people will pour out to the streets to protest. I don't think it's going to do that. Yes, there may be a okay. Yeah. Um, we are not going to be seeing the level of protest we saw in Kenya in 2024 with the End Finance Bill protest that was mostly led by young people against the government's plan to raise taxes to pay to fulfill its external debt duties. At most, what we're going to see is measures towards evasion. Tax evasion has always been a thing in Nigeria. I think that I saw a a newspaper clip from Archive NG that dates back to the 1970s or the 1980s, where Sokoto government officials are telling Nigerians to not evade taxes. So what we are going to be seeing at best is complaints online, criticisms of the bill in public-facing newspapers and the likes, and then a method of adjustment that would come to, at the very least, using things like what is it called now? Using things like cash as opposed to card payments or online payments.
Yeah.
It's not we are not going to be seeing people pouring out to the street. At the very least, Nigerians are some of the most taxed people in this part of the world. What we'll be saying is that instead of me paying with an electronic transfer for something I buy, I would not be able to do that. I would not want to do that because the person selling would not want to do that, because if I pay that money into the person's account, the person is going to get taxed. And as such, cash will remain king in this part of the world. And economies like ours, cash is always king. So people are going to resort to cash. And it's going to lead to a lot of circulation in the economic, cash circulation in the economy. And it will remain to be seen if people resort to this, if and when people resort to this method of tax evasion, how the Nigerian government is going to be able to respond to it. But if you're looking for the kind of protests we saw in 2024 with the End Bad Governance protest of August, I'm not sure that's going to happen. If you're expecting the type of protest you saw in Kenya in July of 2024, I doubt if it's going to happen, because we do not have the bandwidth, the political elites in Nigeria do not have the bandwidth to lead such protests rather. And there isn't much appetite for that, street rallies and everything. So the government is more inclined to continue with that.
I mean, I do agree with you, Confidence, because I think that a lot of people resort to cash, and that takes us back from our policy, our e-policy, where we're trying to see more people use digital platforms to transact. That's all for today. Thank you very much, Confidence, for joining us on today's episode and for bringing your diverse perspective to this conversation.
Thank you once again. My regards.
To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access it anywhere you find podcasts. Please search for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, like, and share, and let us know your thoughts in the comment section. For deeper insights into our work, you can visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. Thank you for tuning in to the week ahead. Join us next Friday for more updates shaping the African continent. Thank you.